Everybody, and welcome to the Glacier Book Club. Our last meeting, a melancholy moment, our last evening, but we've certainly saved one of the best for last here in 2022. Looking forward to another great year. We've got our books selected for 2023, but when I first started thinking about the 2022 book club, the very first book that I was asked to try and track down the author and see if we could get him to join us was Home Waters by John Maclean. I immediately knew that was a big ask because this is, John Maclean is an acclaimed writer. This is his sixth book, more than 30 years as the Washington correspondent for the Chicago Tribune. So there's a kind of a big gulp when you reach out to someone that prominent and wonder whether they might be willing to join you. And John, thank you so much for agreeing to join us tonight from Washington, D.C.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Doug. It's a pleasure to be here. We were talking earlier and you said that you've got people who are going to be participating from all over the country. And I think that's wonderful. Montana is kind of a locus and a magnet for a lot of people. Glacier Park and now the Blackfoot Valley. If the BLM doesn't completely mess it up, having paved Johnsrud Park, we'll see. Yeah, Home Waters has been out now for about a year and a half, and it's a departure for me because my previous 5 books were all about fatal wildland fires, and it has been a real pleasure to do it.
Damn it.
Because it seems to make people happy, and it has made me happy. The first thing it does is establish very strongly a sense of place. And I'm going to pop up my PowerPoint here.
Great.
And get started with that. Oops.
Yeah, I think you're right about Montana. You know, there's that theory about Kevin Bacon, the 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon. I think Montana is more like 5. And it really is a place of great connectivity.
Can you hear me, Doug? I think I've done something awful.
No, we can hear you great. We can't see your shared screen yet.
Oh, that's what I'm having trouble with.
but that will come along.
You think?
Oh yeah.
Talking about Zoom now. Well, I was saying before I so rudely interrupted myself by being incompetent technologically, that one thing the book has done is establish a sense of place. The place is, of course, the Blackfoot Valley, but it's more than that. It's Montana. It's kind of a way of life that existed as a kind of Eden, at least in memory and in family lore. And parts of it still exist. I've had this as an ongoing argument or discussion with a lot of friends. You know, say, John, you know, you knock this thing too much. You say it's all gone. And in fact, it's not all gone. There's a lot of it left. You have to hunt for it a little harder, but it's still there. So I accept that. This is the Blackfoot River in Montana, just up from Scotty Brown's Bridge. It's a hole that everybody in my family has fished from time immemorial. If you look on the upper right, you see a snag standing up there without any leaves. Its topmost part just above the Garnet Mountains. And there's usually an eagle on top of that. I remember one time fishing the opposite bank with my dad and George Kuenneberg's, that my dad came around that corner, as you can see right up in here. And he had this incredible smile on his face. And I said, well, what happened? He said, well, I was fishing this hole right up in here and I caught a great big cutthroat. And I looked over my shoulder and there were 2 deer watching me. And I looked above the 2 deer and there was an eagle on that tree. That's the line from that is now part of American lore and American literature. In our family, there was no clear line between religion and fly fishing. I've traced it a little bit over time and where it came from. It obviously came from his upbringing and from a store of creativity. But it also came, I think, a bit from Ernest Hemingway and his story, Big Two-Hearted River. And I'll get into that a little later as we move along. The photograph on the left is from in front of our cabin at Seeley Lake. That's paradise that isn't lost when you look at the photograph. Likewise, the one on the right, which is along Johns Road on the Blackfoot River. You can still get it. I mean, you can still get out there and kind of dodge the boats. I complain that you almost have to have a spreadsheet to figure out when the boats are not going to be at a certain point until a certain hour. You know, they're not going to get here until noon or 1 o'clock, and I can go fish in the morning. And then in the evening, say, well, they have to be past here by about 5 o'clock, because otherwise they're not going to make it to the next landing. So I can go fish there and get what you see in that right-hand photograph. We did live in two worlds, and we went back and forth between them, and it was, to me, very uncomfortable for a long time. We lived in Chicago, in the Hyde Park neighborhood around the University of Chicago, which is about as high-powered an intellectual community as you can imagine. When I was very young, the memory of the Manhattan Project, which was the invention of the atomic bomb, was still very much alive there. We used to go into the stadium at Stagg Field, us kids, irresponsible kids, and look around for the handball court where the first chain reaction had occurred. And we found it and got bawled out by our parents who said, you know, there's maybe radioactivity left there. That was one world. And then in great contrast was this cabin you see on the right. This year is the 100th anniversary, the centennial anniversary of the year in which my grandfather and his two sons, Norman and Paul, began constructing that cabin along with Mrs. Maclean, who was an essential part of that, the Reverend's wife, my grandmother. The year that they put up the roof on that, both the boys, Norman and Paul, were away working. And the Reverend and Mrs. Maclean, they may have had some help from neighbors, but they put that roof up, just the two of them themselves. 100 years later, a log cabin's supposed to have about 100 years in it. We've taken very good care of this thing. Those logs are soaked in linseed oil and turpentine. You don't even want to shout fire when you're near them. If a fire ever got near that thing, it would go up like a torch. But it has kept the logs in really beautiful condition. Another shot of the porch looking out at the lake, and we have a little cluster of deer who come by the cabin every night about 5 o'clock. They've been off in the woods sleeping all day. And they get up and they want to go feed on deer moss and get a drink of water. Usually 5 or 6 of them. I'll walk all the way around the cabin. And after you've been there a few weeks, they get to be friends and friendly. They don't mind you quite as much as they did when it all started. This again is the cabin from Seeley Lake. The fish on the left is in the book, is in Home Waters. One October, there was an unusual long period of great calm, just as there was only with wind this year, where there was no clouds in the sky. And in the year I'm thinking about, there was no wind at all, so that the lake was glassy and the water was glassy. And I would go fishing every night down on the Blackfoot River and get my head handed to me. And the fish were just not working. Nothing was happening. So I was sitting about here from where the picture was taken one night. And I noticed a lot of rise forms right out in the lake, just in this area here. And I thought, you know, the lake has been ruined as a fishery, a trout fishery, because northern pike were bucket dumped in there. And they just destroyed it, destroyed the trout. But these were rise forms, and that's what trout do. And so I hopped in the canoe and went out there. And what I got into was a remnant population of the trout. These were giants who had lived on the bottom and who weren't impervious to northern pike, but could put up a pretty decent defense. And I hooked into this enormous cutthroat that you see on the left. He has been measured against that photograph and against that rod. I've had other people look at it, and he was over 27 inches, maybe 28. And I had a long, long fight with him to get him in, and got him in the canoe. And normally cutthroat just sit there and smile. If a fish can smile while their pictures are taken, they like it. And then you gently put them back in and everything's fine. This guy wasn't like that. He bounced all over the bottom of the canoe. And I took this fast picture and thought, I better get this guy back in the water. Otherwise he's gonna be in trouble. And I put him in the water and I let him go. And he was dead. He was dead on arrival. And he just went down like a stone, nothing moving. And I was just conscience struck by it. However, I did have the picture, and a friend of mine in Seeley Lake did mock-ups and reproductions, models of fish, and he did one of this cutthroat. And it's above the cash register at Rivero's at Seeley Lake. And Doug Mitchell has it on a picture of it on his wall. He's holding it now. As you can see, it has now been shrunk to 6 inches. Well, that's a big fish. That was quite a night. River Runs Through It has changed the face of Montana. And some of it has been good and some of it has really not been good. The not being good part of it is uncomprehending experience seekers who have arrived in their legions. I wish that were my phrase, but it's not. It belongs to Ross Toole's nephew. I mentioned in the book a photograph of a baptismal party at the cabin. The Reverend performed services there, and on one occasion, he baptized Ross Toole, who became the very great history professor at the University of Montana, wrote a standard history of Montana, was absolutely adored by his students. And just this last week, in the last couple of days, I've gotten a letter, email from his nephew, Ross Toole, Ryan Toole, Ross Toole's nephew, asking about the photograph and could I provide it to him, which I did. And we figured out who the people are. And indeed, the one I thought was Ross Toole is. But he wrote back and he said, John, I share your feeling about Paradise Lost in Montana, and that now we've been inundated with uncomprehending experience seekers. And that's true up to a point. In fairness, other people have shown up too. I hear a story or two a year that's the same, which is, I was a kid in the upper Adirondacks. I'm 15 or 16 years old when I read A River Runs Through It. I knew that that's the life that I wanted to live, and I've come out here, and now I live here. And these are usually people who are giving back a lot. They work for conservation organizations. They understand the legacy and they understand the ethic, and they're giving to it. And I celebrate them. I think that that's absolutely wonderful. And they are a big number. The money that has poured in to restore the Blackfoot and to restore other fisheries in Montana has been extraordinary. And the Blackfoot has been brought back. It's a much better fishery than when it was when I was a kid, to be honest with you. I mean, I'm a better fisherman, that is part of it. But you can go out and catch, 3 or 4 big 16 to 20 inch fish in a day. And when I was a kid, if you got one of those, and I say you, I mean my father too, if you got 1 or 2 of those in a season, that was a season. So the fishing's better. There are too many people, but some of them are really worth having around. All right, River Runs Through It, and especially the movie, brought everybody out to Montana, to the Blackfoot River. Home Waters highlights conservation, and I have made that a work of mine. I have been fighting Steve Daines, trying to get the Blackfoot Clearwater Stewardship Act, helped get it passed. We haven't succeeded, but we did have a markup in the fall for the first time. It's a good bill, and there are many others that are worthwhile, many other efforts that are worthwhile. I generally go down the Blackfoot once a year with somebody from American Rivers, a donor or two, and it's a surprising experience. I mean, these guys are corporate heavy hitters, and their corporations give a lot of money. And you will think you'd be getting people who are corporate. And I haven't had a dud yet. You spend a day on a boat with a guy, and they like to fish, and you get to talk to them, and you get an intimate situation. And you find out that they're interesting people, and that they have some depth to them, and they are doing what they can for the rivers. No, are we stuck here? Home water's effects have been considerable, and have been more than conservation. This has surprised and gladdened me, because all kinds of things have happened as a consequence of the book. One of the first things that happened was that the Library of Congress's Teaching with Primary Sources program put some money into this and sponsored 10 projects with museums and others in the state of Montana, based on both home waters and a river runs through it. The projects were all over the lot, and I'm happy to say, very diverse. Ovando, the kids at the school in Ovando dug into their own legacy and into their own history, and expanded their sense of where they are, their own sense of place. The town of Paradise took on a project, did something of the same thing. There was a rediscovery of the Native American pathway that runs along the Blackfoot, the river of the road to the buffalo. I wrote a very long chapter in Home Waters about that. I realize it's very long, and people have been kind about it, but some people have said, if you're into Lewis and Clark, you're going to like this, but it's long. I knew that was going to happen. The reason I did it that way is that the road to the buffalo has been somewhat neglected as an historical artifact. For one cause, Meriwether Lewis went through the Blackfoot Valley on a return trip in 1806 with a small party. When he got across the divide and into the plains around the Missouri River, he ran into the Blackfeet and had a fatal encounter with them, and 2 Blackfeet were killed. And that's what the historians fix on, and should. It's the only time there's that kind of a fight, and a fatal fight on the whole trip. So what gets ignored is this trip from Traveler's Rest at the Bitterroot to the Lewis and Clark Pass at the Continental Divide. The significance of it is that as soon as the first horse with a European set foot on that road to the buffalo, it was the beginning of the end of a civilization that had lasted for millennia. The road to the buffalo was the pathway for tribes all over the west of the Continental Divide to come on various trails to this interstate highway, the road to the buffalo, that paralleled the Blackfoot River, make their way across the Continental Divide out onto the plains, hunt the buffalo, go back home. It was often a bloody return with hostile enemies waiting for them. But that was the pattern, and they usually did it twice a year. And this pathway was so rutted that the Nez Perce, who were accompanying Lewis the first day, told him, "We're not going to go with you because you're going into Blackfoot country and we don't want to go there. But you will not miss that trail. There's no way you can miss it." So it was deeply cut. And in doing the research for that chapter, I went with a guy, the historian of the Seeley Lake Historical Society, and we looked at a couple of places where you can still see the trail. It's not that hard once you look at it to envision that this was the trail. There's usually an up gulch lip to it, 6 or 7 inches. It isn't as wide as a wagon. You couldn't drive a Jeep on it. It's not narrow enough for a game trail. It's just right for a travel or a file of Indians going through there. And fine. One of the projects that has come out of the Library of Congress's Teaching with Primary Sources is a further examination of that trail. And things have been discovered, more things have been discovered. Kim Brigham, who used to write for the Missoulian, is conducting this. And one of the things that we looked at when I was doing the research were 2 rock cairns on 9 Mile Prairie. On the left, you see one of them. And they're flat. And what are they? The guy all the way to the right in that pictures with red walking sticks is Ron Cox. And he's the historian who led me on my initial investigation of this. And he and Kim Brigham and some other people, including the archaeologist for Traveler's Rest, went to this rock cairn just in the last few weeks. You can see the weather. This is late October. And looked at it and tried to have thoughts about it. And the first thought was that the cairns are not Farmer Jones's rock piles tossed there so that he can raise wheat or alfalfa. These are Native American cairns. They had some purpose. There were 2 of them. The other one is just like this. And if you went right between them, coming out from the Blackfoot, you would be pointed right to this spot. You can see the different color of the vegetation there. These are aspen trees that have changed color. That aspen grove is where Lewis and his party had lunch or dined, as it says in the journals, on the 2nd day of their trip into the Blackfoot Valley. So perhaps the cairns were a guide to that spot. There's water there and fodder. Perhaps not. I mean, you can't say exactly what it was. What can be said is that they are hundreds and hundreds of years old and that they had some purpose. So it's the kind of thing that it keeps popping up from home waters. And it's been just a real joy. I was just in Ohio and Kentucky doing what I do. And a friend of mine there had gotten the dance class at Northern Kentucky University to come up with a dance based on home waters and a river runs through it. And then home waters run deep. And when I heard about this, I thought, uh-oh, this could be difficult. They performed it at the Cincinnati Art Museum, this huge audience, more than 200 people. And it was absolutely marvelous. The kids had worked on it all semester, and they had a teacher who had liberated them, said, you figure it out. And there were passages in the dance, about 15-minute dance, where those of us who fish looked at it and talked about this afterwards and said, they were fish. They were a pod of fish. That's the way they were acting. They reproduced it beautifully. And we were all so struck by this that the dance is now going to be filmed. It's in the process of being filmed and recorded for future use by Northern Kentucky University and me. And I'm hoping to find some way to get it out. When I got up after the dance to give my talk, I've never taken on an audience that was as warmed up as that. They were just joyful having watched this. It also included a fisherman. If you can see him on the right there, the older guy kneeling is a master caster. And that's his 5-year-old granddaughter, who, by the way, was pretty good. And her father is there, and he was a beginning caster, and you could tell the difference. Home Waters has also led me back into Ernest Hemingway's Big Two-Hearted River. What happened was I got an invitation like this one to give a talk to the Community Public Library in Ketchum, Idaho, which is the custodian for the Mary and Ernest Hemingway house in Ketchum. So I gave a Zoom talk. And in preparing for that, I thought I ought to say something about Ernest Hemingway. And since Big Two-Hearted River is in the book, I went back and started investigating it again. It was a very important book, a story to my father and to me. My dad gave it to me when I was very young. I tried to figure out how young, I may have been a teenager, 13, 14. And what it did for me was bring together those two worlds that I was talking about earlier. The University of Chicago with its high intellectual content, and Montana and trout fishing. And it made it possible to see trout fishing as literature. It did that for me, and it did that for my father. The theme of Big Two-Hearted River is the restoration of the spirit by fishing. And I think that that at least infected my father and stuck with him, and may have had some contribution to the opening line of A River Runs Through It. The influences of his own father are probably stronger. But I think that Hemingway was there. This is a very different place. Hemingway took a trip in 1919 after he'd gotten back from the Great War and been wounded to the Fox River in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. There's the Fox River, very different from the Blackfoot, beautiful in its own way. The countryside had been burned over by some of the fires that regularly burned the North Woods after the catastrophic logging of the late 19th and early 20th century. And he talks about Seney had been burned over, but it could not all have been burned. He also talks about going to a bridge and looking down into the Fox River after a long absence from woods and waters, watching trout finning in the waters below and thinking they were very satisfactory. That's the bridge today. I couldn't find a date on it. It almost certainly is a replacement bridge, but it almost certainly is very much like the one that was there. The tracks are in exactly the same place. So that's where his trip started in 1919. After I had given my talk in Ketchum by Zoom, I got very interested, further interested in the story. And I wound up going to the JFK Library in Boston and looking at all the drafts, the handwritten and typed drafts of Big Two-Hearted River. And then I went to Seney in the Upper Peninsula and went to the bridge and tried fishing there. And then I've been invited to be a guest writer in residence at the Hemingway House in Ketchum, and I did that last month for a week. And in the course of that, I planted an idea with my editor at Mariner Classics, the HarperCollins imprint that published Home Waters. And he determined it'd be a really good idea to do a book, and to do a book of Ernest Hemingway's Big Two-Hearted River. The centennial is coming, the publication is coming up in 2025. This is the cover of the book, which just was finalized. My foreword to it just went to the copy reader 2 days before HarperCollins had its strike, if you've been following that curious little piece of news. And like the other stuff, like the River of the Road to the Buffalo, I've found out new things about the Big Two-Hearted River as a consequence of getting involved again. For a long time, people didn't know where the fishing had happened. Big Two-Hearted River is not where it happened. When I was a kid, a cub reporter in Chicago, I used to fish the Big Two-Hearted River. I'd go up there on my short vacations. That's not where he fished. He fished somewhere on the Fox. But when I looked down at the Fox in Seney and then tried to fish it, I realized that's not where he fished. He didn't fish that part of the Fox. There is a branch, the east branch of the Fox, some miles away, that absolutely matches the descriptions in Big Two-Hearted River. And I think that that is where it happened. I discovered this postcard. It was part of a PBS, it was published as part of a PBS Hemingway exhibit, but it says clearly that they fished 10 miles north in Schoolcraft County, presumably meaning 10 miles north of Seney, and it gives the exact dates for the trip. I also discovered in a cache of new material at the community library in Ketchum a map of Seney that was made by a guy who lived there from 1916 on into the 1960s. And this shows very clearly that there were a lot of fires around Seney at the time of Hemingway's trip. And it also shows that the East Branch, which as you can see in the upper left there, parallels the regular Fox River. Hemingway said in a letter to his father, a letter later after that postcard, that they fished several branches. So that's probably where it happened. You see the Hemingway house on the left, that's the writer's residence down in what was the garage, a wonderful place to spend time. This is the interior of the Hemingway house. He just lived there for 2 years. If you see the vestibule on the right, that's where his final act occurred. This is the bedroom with the desk where he worked and where Mary Hemingway then worked for several decades. She lived into the 1980s. He killed himself in the early 60s. Back to the Blackfoot. This is the Muchmore Hole, which is the beginning and the end of Home Waters. This is from last month. And that's an enormous cutthroat, about a 19-inch cutthroat. So I was saying earlier, if I'd caught that kind of a fish when I was 16, 15, 14 years old, that would have been all you talked about all winter long. This was one of a number of fish. That was the big cutthroat of the day, but it wasn't the biggest fish of the day. Somebody caught a brown that was a little bigger than that. And there on the right is my partner from American Rivers, a donor, and I both have fish on at the same time. We did that twice in that hole. But this is what's left too. After all the busyness and all the too many rafts and 75 rigs parked at one put in at the height of the summer, there are times when you can get away. That's a nice broad photograph of the Muchmore Hole. And here's somebody getting away and living the dream. Great solitude. But if you look over his shoulder and look back up the river a little bit to right here, you will see the beginning of the armada of boats coming down. This guy is a very dear friend of mine, Jay Probst, who owns the ranch on this side of the river and allows me to fish there with him. And that's where we were fishing the day I caught the big fish. That becomes part of the book. So you get both worlds there. You get spread out Muchmore Hole, and it's a beautiful hole. But we're just about to leave because the boats are starting to come down. And sometimes come down and sit on that hole for 2 hours, which is not sportsmanlike. A mixed bag. Thank you. How are you, Doug?
Okay, there we go. Thank you. I was having trouble getting my mute button off. That's really extraordinary, and thank you for kind of giving us that overview. I'm, taken by so many things, but one of the things as we think of as glacier lovers, now I want to go back a little bit to what you said about the pro and con about a river runs through it, right? We feel like we're being over discovered in Glacier as well.
Absolutely.
And we're being loved to death a little bit. How did that feel? I mean, you're kind of a little bit out the other side, right? The rebirth of the river, the reinvestment, we're still at the beginning stages. Give us some advice as you were going through that. How did that feel, and how did you talk to the community about needing to take care of the place before it got ruined?
The community got it. They got it on their own. There were organizations that worked on it. Big Blackfoot Chapter, Trout Unlimited, Blackfoot Challenge. I mean, that's local people. And that was the magic of it. The government figured out what it should do, which it doesn't always figure out. They discovered that if they want to do a conservation project on the Blackfoot, they want to do some tributary restoration or fencing something off from cattle or whatever it is, they would have to file an EIS, they would have to go through an administrative procedure, blah, blah, blah. If they just gave the money to the Blackfoot Challenge, those people would go out, knock on the rancher's door, who was their neighbor, say, we'd like to come on your property and do some trib restoration. And it happened that, these guys were not all that eager to do it, or, well, what the hell are you doing here on my property? But they were the neighbors, it was all local. So they'd get started and then they'd need something. They'd need some timbers to do some shoring up where they were meandering the stream. And the rancher would be standing up there with a piece of straw in his mouth, watching them, and said, I got a couple of those in the barn, let me go get them for you. And that's the way it went. It was local involvement by everybody. I mean, the people in that county, in Powell County, Missoula County, caught on to it. And forget all this divisions stuff. America's divided, we all hate each other. No, it doesn't work that way when you get something like that where everybody had their heart in it and their head in it, and they learned and grew together. And that was the magic. That's what did it.
Yeah, it's cool partnership when you've got private landowners and old school ranchers and environmentalists and loggers. Everybody has that shared sense of community. And speaking of community, one of my privileges is to be in community with the very talented Amy Lucky. And Amy, I know we've got some terrific questions in the chat. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you and maybe you can walk us through some of those questions.
Yeah, for sure. So as usual, Carl and Candy are going to kick us off. I have a question about the filming of A River Runs Through It, John, and were you present during any of that filming? And if so, what did you experience?
Well, I was not heavily involved in the movie. I did go there while they were filming it around Livingston and spent a couple of days there. But at the time, I was the foreign editor of the Chicago Tribune, and I had a job that just didn't stop. And I had been in Washington, and my sister was in Chicago, who was heavily involved in it. I was not heavily involved, but I was around it, and Livingston can handle that. What I know about it is that they came into the Blackfoot Valley and looked at it as a possible place to film. You have to remember that the filming was done when my father was no longer with us. And that I know a little bit about, that the first script that came through just sent him through the roof. I mean, he was really very offended by it. It begins with a scene with Paul on the dock at Seeley Lake. He's got a big rainbow. He lands it, the camera zooms in, he holds the fish in front of it like that and breaks his neck. And, you might as well try to break my father's neck. And they had to scrape him off the ceiling. And I think what happened, certainly what happened in terms of time, is that Redford outweighed him. He knew that if he tried to make the film while my dad was around, I'm extrapolating, I'm putting words in his mouth, but I think it's true, that if he tried to make it while my dad was around, it was going to be one fight after another like that. And as soon as my father was gone, they started work on the movie. I think they did a good job. It would have been different if my dad had lived. But I think that the thing that I like about the movie most is that a whole family can watch it. The kids identify with Paul. They know you cannot act that way and get away with it. Something bad is going to happen. And when it does, they don't have to see it. It's off screen. The violence is not there. And for adults, it's an adult film. I mean, there's stuff in there that people are attracted to the way they're attracted to the book. I mean, it touches people. It really is a magnetic experience. And the film is now 30 years old. It's still around. It still does well. It did very well during the pandemic. There was a big rush on it. The Museum of Fly Fishing, the American Museum of Fly Fishing, hosted a get together of all the movie people this fall to celebrate the 30 years. So what are you going to say? Yes, it changed things in Montana. Blackfoot is being loved to death. Glacier is being loved to death. You have to do something about this, and it's not a state where regulation comes easy. People don't want that, but they've got to do something. And the guides and the fishing people who are in the industry, who rely on it year after year, not just hit and miss, but the real people, they know what needs to be done and they talk about it. And for some reason, the government agencies are very slow. The state is not good at all. But the Fed could step in here, and it's just not happening at the governmental level. It is there at the local level. The locals know what needs to be done. You've got to start limiting the number of boats, for one thing. And there are different ways of doing that where it's profitable and humane, and people aren't fouled up. So no, you can't go ever fish the Blackfoot. Yeah, you can do it, but there's a way of doing it where you don't have 75 to 100 rigs parked at Harry Morgan put in at the same time. No river in Montana can handle that kind of pressure. So,
Good point.
Really interesting points, John, for sure, and certainly what we talk about a lot here in Glacier Country as well. So you sort of answered the second question, because Eric and Tanya wanted to know, in Robert Redford's foreword for A River Runs Through It, he mentions that he had a hard time earning your father's trust and making the movie from the book. And they asked what finally turned the tables and getting him to agree. And did he agree, I guess?
He did. He gave creative control and a contract, and that's absolutely unheard of. I mean, Redford did a marvelous job. I did a great job with my dad. With some bumps along the way, he made an appointment to see him and didn't show up on that day, and showed up with a big smile on his face the next day. And my father opened the door and said, "Robert, you're a day late," and he closed the door, and that was the end of it.
Wow.
People had to run. Yeah, that was my old man. And people had to rush in and kind of repair the thing and so on. But he liked Redford. And, they pretended that Redford was a Scot, which he wasn't really. I think he's mostly Irish. But they played that, and they both knew it was a play, and they found a way to get along. I remember my dad really wanted that movie made. He did. And he wanted to be there to see it, and that didn't happen. But part of that's on him.
Our friend Ed asked, you mentioned Wordsworth a few times in the book.
Yes, I do.
Does the scene in the movie where the father and son recite the intimations of immortality ode ring true for your family?
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. Yeah. That's the way they behaved on this kind of high plane. That's what the Reverend was like. He was a man of noble prose, a man who loved the English Romantic poets and who quoted them, and not mushy-wushy. I mean, he was anything but that. He was a very tough guy, and he wanted his kids to be very tough, and they were. But they had this other side to them. Dad always said, my mother wanted me to be a church flower boy, and my father wanted me to be a tough guy. And that's the way he passed some of that along.
John, I wanted to ask about I was really interested in the section of your book where you give us some insight into the Pulitzer Committee and not granting a prize that year.
Right.
Talk a little bit about that. That was really very interesting. I did not know that part of the story.
Well, the River Runs Through It was up for the Pulitzer, and the committee that decides those things presented a list, and that was at the top of the list. And the overall committee decided that there were no distinguished entries. And that quote was attributed to my editor, Clayton Kirkpatrick, at the Chicago Tribune. Clayton Kirkpatrick was a wonderful man, a very decent man, and I admired him then and I admire him now. But I wrote him a very sharp letter about it. Every now and then you got to push all the blue chips out there. I don't know if, a book of short stories, it's the first book by an aging professor, is a normal candidate for a Pulitzer. It's not. If you look back now, you'd say, well, it should have won the Pulitzer. It's great literature. It has stood the test of time. It's one of the great pieces of American literature. There's a survey of the whole fishing industry recently done. Who are the most famous fishermen in America? John Maclean is the most famous fisherman in America. That's worth a Pulitzer. You got a book got you there. I don't know how my dad felt about it. I know he was very glad I'd written that letter. But I don't know that he felt that, oh, I should have won. I was, when I finished the book and wrote the end, well, there's a Pulitzer entry if there was one. I don't think he, in some ways, I don't think he cared, Doug. I think, he knew what he had done. He was really content and happy with that. And if the Pulitzer wanted to give him the prize, that's fine. He would have been happy with it. But he wasn't lusting for it the way so many of us do.
Do you think, John, that might have had something to do with the age he was when he wrote that book and had that success, and maybe a 20-something would have reacted differently?
Absolutely. No, he was 73 years old when the book came out. His first book he'd ever written. It was magic. He knew what he'd done. The reviews that started coming in, Nick Lyons' first review said this is an American classic. He and Nick Lyons became very dear friends. Nick Lyons is now my very dear friend. His daughter has been my agent from day one for almost 30 years. I got her just when she started out as an agent. I just got a note from her today. She got a contract, came through. So, yeah, I mean, I think he saw it as having done it. Then when he moved to doing other things, he thought it was going to be easy and move smoothly, even though he didn't have much time left. And he got into it and it didn't. He got into Young Men and Fire and never got out of it. And that was not the happiest of experiences. They went on and on and on for about 14 years. Even when he couldn't function very well anymore, he'd get that manuscript out and just with a pencil and look at it. So that was a different thing. The Pulitzer, yeah, I mean, been nice.
Yeah, it'd be one thing to lose it to some other great writer, to say there are no worthy ones.
Nobody got it that year.
It stings a little bit, yeah, for sure. And I know, Amy, I know that Brent has a question. John's been kind enough to offer to sign book plates for folks. So if you'd like a book plate signed, just email Sean, or you can use the chat, Sean, at glacier.org. And we'll make sure that we get those to John to sign, and we'll get them back out to you folks. So Amy, I know that Brent's got a question, and I've got a little bit of a John Maclean speed round to finish us off tonight.
Okay, great. And I think, do we still need to do giveaways? Or did we already do?
And we have the winners. So
we have the winners. Okay. Yeah. All right. So hang tight, everyone. Brent wanted to know if your grandparents were accurately depicted in A River Runs Through It.
Oh, I don't think Mrs. Maclean ever gets her due. I think that the Reverend Tom Skerritt did an absolutely brilliant job of him. The Reverend was gone by the time I came along, but I've kind of made a study of him. And read things about him and looked at photographs and all my memories of my dad talking about him. And Skerritt just nailed it for me. I mean, he got him. Mrs. Maclean was a formidable woman. She was the Reverend's wife and knew her place in a way that would not be acceptable to women these days, but that was a very sturdy place. things would not have been possible without her. She handled all the parish work, all the, the human contact kind of parish work, and he did the intellectual stuff and hung out with his friends. The First Presbyterian Church in those days and still has the kind of the business and intellectual elite of Missoula, Montana. I mean, one of his greatest friends was A.J. Gibson, the great architect of the Toole family, was revered, and so on. Mrs. Maclean was a real presence. I knew her for a long time, Granny. Didn't even know her name was anything different from Granny. I loved her and she loved me and spoiled me, which a grandmother is allowed to do. But she also was this major force in the church with the guilds and at the human level. And I don't think that she's been given her full due.
Well, our three winners tonight, Andre Anderberg, Ann Herring McLeod, and Stephen Raymond. Thank you, and we'll get buffs out to the three of you, and the Mullenses and Brent are our other extra credit winners. So we'll get a shirt out to you guys as well. So I didn't warn you about this, John, but we occasionally have what we like to call the speed round. So I've got a few questions, very.
It's like a 2-minute football drill.
It's exactly correct. So the first one is Royal Wolf or Royal Trude?
Either one.
Either one, okay. Correct answer. Abbey or Stegner?
For what?
Just who you got both books. You can only take one to that desert island. You're
You
gonna
take one to a desert island? I would take Abbey.
Okay. Cubs or White Sox?
Cubs.
Okay, it's the battle of the Brawl of the Wild this weekend. Tough question for anybody associated with Montana. Cats or Grizz?
Grizz.
Grizz, very good. And then last but not least, Blackfoot IPA or Cold Smoke?
You stumped the author.
Okay, well, see, these are frosty beverages. So I will just take that lack of an answer as an invitation to share a beer with you one night, and we can decide.
I don't drink.
Okay, well, I will taste them both for you, and I will decide. Well, John Maclean, thank you so very much for sharing a late evening. Folks, John joined us from Washington, D.C., where it is 2 hours later than it is here and 3 hours from the West Coast. So thank you so much, John. And thanks to everybody. Again, what a great year we've had together. Look forward to next year. The other three books I forgot, which I can't believe I did. First Rangers, amazing book. C.W. Guthrie, who is no longer with us. So we're going to have a couple of one of the researchers, Ann Fagry, and then the editor or publisher of the book with us as well. And then we're gonna have Grizzly in the Driveway by our friend Rob Cheney at the Missoulian. That's going to be a terrific kind of talking about kind of this new why bears are back in the Rocky Mountain West and in our driveways. And then 4/5 of Grizzly with Doug Chadwick. We're gonna have Chad back. As you'll remember, he came and talked the Wolverine Way. He has a new book out published by Patagonia. It's very special, as are all of you. So thank you all. I will not see you. So I wish you a very happy holidays with friends and family. You have blessed me and us this year greatly. And I thank you for all of that. Thanks and good night.
Thank you, John.